Ready? Can you hear me out there?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, friends, and welcome. This wisdom of the ages, as transmitted by H.P. Blavatsky, lays out our birthright to immortality. The path to immortality that she points to in the Secret Doctrine and other writings is a complete system that is in sync with the laws of nature. You find parts of this system in science and in modern religions of the world. The path to immortality is an obligatory pilgrimage that each of us must take. Neither HPV nor the masters she was the representative of, nor anyone else can take it for us. They can only point the way. We must experience that path ourselves as we assimilate the genuine philosophy placed before us. This is very challenging and a slow process. HPV warns us repeatedly about the charlatans out there who claim to offer shortcuts in exchange for money. Misinformation abounds, and even the most educated continues to be deluded. The ULT was established in 1909 to bring back the original teachings of H.P. Blavatsky and her colleague, William Q. Judge. The ULT makes available the unaltered secret doctrine as left by HPB and Isis and Veil and other documents that had gone out of print. ULT brought it back into print, and it's available to all who find it. ULT continues to deliver this message of genuine theosophy, so we can approach our teachers directly through their writings. Studying the writings of H.P. Blavatsky and William Q. Judge, if continued over time, an approach with patience and determination provides a solvent to dissolve the temporary glamour of the world. Theosophy shows that we unfold true happiness not through an external guru, but from within to without, through the gift of the human mind, transforming itself into its true identity of spiritual mind. The serious inquiry open to all is the function and goal of the ULT. Students from the Washington, D.C. ULT gathered here at the Moon Green Historic District in Manassas, Virginia, every first Sunday of the month at 11 a.m. for a talk on particular thinking. Thanks to today's technology, if you can't join us physically, you are invited to join us, and this will be on the internet. meet.google/mdp-tshi-mzi for a monthly talk from the lodge and periodic talks on Google Meet with roundtable discussions in the room. Next Sunday, you're invited to join us on Google Meet at 11 a.m. as we continue our roundtable readings and discussions of the Ocean of Theosophy by Mr. Judge and answers the questions on the Ocean of Theosophy by Mr. Crosby. If you have any problems getting on the Google Meet, or if we can help in any way, please email us or call us. And the phone number is 301-656-3566. And our email address is ultlodge@gmail.com. Yeah, that will all be out there on the internet whenever we can get to it. We're all volunteers. Contributions of time and money are never solicited, but appreciated, especially and the Paris ULT, which has two major expenditures for renovations for public safety. If you desire to help, please contact Paris or us or your local ULT, depending on what you're thinking. Today's devotional reading comes from the Bhagavad Gita, on page 28, 128. Men, being contented and devoted to their own particular duties, attain perfection. Here now, how that perfection is attained by devotion to natural duty. If a man maketh an offering to the Supreme Being, who is the source of the works of all, and by whom this universe was spread abroad, he thus obtaineth perfection. The performance of the duties of a man's own particular calling, although devoid of excellence, is better than doing the duty of another. However well performed, and he who fulfills the duties obligated by nature does not incur sin. A man's own natural duty, even though stained with faults, ought not to be abandoned. For all human acts are involved in faults, as the fire is wrapped in smoke. The highest perfection of freedom from action is attained through renunciation by him who is in all works, has an unfettered mind and subdued heart. Learn from me in brief on what it means, what manner the man who has reached perfection attains to the Supreme Spirit, which is the end, the aim, and the highest condition of spiritual knowledge. Imbued with pure discrimination, restraining himself with resolution, having rejected the charms of sound and other objects of the senses, and casting off attachment and dislike, dwelling in secluded places, eating little, with speech, body, and mind control, engaging in constant meditation and unwaveringly fixed in dispassion, abandoning egotism, arrogance, violence, vanity, desire, anger, pride, and tradition, with calmness ever present, a man is fitted to be the Supreme Being. And having thus attained to the Supreme, he is in serene sorrowing no more, and no more desiring, but alike towards all creatures, he attains the supreme devotion to me. By the devotion to me, he knoweth fundamentally who and what I am, and having thus discovered me, he enters into me without any intermediate condition. We're going to have the declaration of ULT, and it's read and maybe talked about, and three fundamentals of the secret doctrine, which we really need to understand to get anything, to get enough out of, to get maximum out of the doctrine, will now be addressed by other students and volunteers, followed by today's talk on Gnosticism Part 2. On April 3, 2022, Part 1 was given. You can view this talk and many others on our website at www.urt.org, urtdc.org.
First, the declaration. The policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy, without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the Theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is a dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification and practice of those principles through a true realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization, and it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. We'll now read the three fundamental propositions. The secret doctrine establishes three fundamentals. First, A. The first fundamental statement of secret doctrine is the metaphysical one absolute, an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by human expression or similitude. It is beyond the range and reach of thought. In the words of Mandukhya, unthinkable and unspeakable. It is a beingness rather than being, and is beyond all thought or speculation. It is one reality symbolized by the term the great breadth. The second fundamental assertion of the secret doctrine is the absolute universality of the law of periodicity, of flux and reflux, ebb and flow, with physical science has observed and recorded in all departments of nature. An alternation such as that of day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking is a fact so common, so perfectly universal and without exception that it is easy to comprehend that in it we see one of the absolutely fundamental laws of the universe. The third fundamental proposition of the secret doctrine asserts identity of all souls with the one universal oversoul. It describes the obligatory pilgrimage of every soul through the cycle of incarnation in accordance with cyclic and karmic law. In order for every divine soul to acquire an independent or conscious existence, it has to have A. Pass over every elemental form of the phenomenal world of that manvantara, and B. Acquired individuality or consciousness first by natural impulse and then by self-induced and self-devised efforts checked by its karma, thus ascending through all the degrees of intelligence, from the lowest to the highest manas, from mineral to plant, up to the holiest archangel, the Dhyani Buddha. The third fundamental proposition further asserts that esoteric philosophy admits no privileges or special gifts in man, save those won by his own ego through personal effort and merit throughout a long series of metempsychoses and reincarnations. And now we'll move over to the talk.
Good morning, friends. Today we will continue with the second talk on Gnosticism. This is second in a series. And those who joined last time may recall that we've talked about the three great teachers of the Gnosticism, the Marcion, Valentinus, and Basilides. So we covered the three thinkers of the end of the first, second, beginning of second century. Today, to understand better how Gnosticism was formed and what it really means in today's context, We will do an overview of the 1st and 2nd century of what was happening, what was the origin of Gnostics, what schools existed, and why it has the great meaning for us today. It is not just a historical overview of the origins of Christianity, but it truly have a profound impact on us today. I would like to start with stating the fact that before Gnostics and before the teaching of Christ, there were many Gnostic schools. To clarify, before Christian Gnostics, there are many Gnostic schools existed in the Middle East, and they were practicing Gnosticism. Basically, Gnosticism means knowledge. Basically, any conclusions, any beliefs that arrive through knowledge, not through faith. So there were a number of Gnostic groups that existed, and to list a few, there were Nazarenes that were based in Nazareth. There were the Therapeutae, Essence, and Ebionites. The wisdom religion that they sourced their gnosis from existed for millennia. They are the Theosophy. And they were coming from the Pythagorean school, from Platonic school, Chaldean, from theurgic mysteries. So the wisdom religion always existed. This is the Theosophy itself. And different Gnostic groups that were just small scattered sects at the time were drawing gnosis from those schools. So they were already in the area. So when the Christ started his teaching, it is very important to note that he did not create a new philosophy, a new teaching. He was actually an adept in the Theosophical movement that studied the wisdom religion from these Gnostic groups. Christ, just like HPB, traveled through Egypt. He settled in Nazareth. According to the Bible, he was raised in Nazareth. According to some other Gnostic sources, he came to Nazareth after visiting Egypt. But this is where he was drawing his knowledge that he synthesized. He was getting it from the Gnostic groups that were all part of theurgic mysteries, and there were also most of them were Kabbalists. He was drawing his source of gnosis from them. And the irony of the history is that the very sects and the groups that existed in the area from whom Jesus was learning were basically eliminated later by the followers of Jesus, the Christians. So this is the strange paradox in the history. But the Gnostics existed before arrival of the Christian Gnosticism. What is very important to know that the first followers of Jesus were coming from the Gnostic schools. There were the Gnostics in the area that were following Christ's teaching originally. There were some Jewish following, but there was also some Gnostic following. So the Gnosticism existed before Jesus' teaching, and it was drawing its source of gnosis from theurgic mysteries and the schools of wisdom religion that existed in centuries. A few words about Christ himself and his teaching. When we speak of Jesus from the Gnostic perspective, he did not come to establish a new religion. And this is the Orthodox Christianity that was established and believed that he came to replace the Judaism with Christianity. No, he did not come to establish a new religion. He came to purify the old. Jesus, as a being adept, knew very well that there is no old and new religions. There is just one wisdom religion, the source of all gnosis, the Theosophy, that needs to be purified and preserved through the ages. So this was his intent, to purify the existing wisdom religion and not to establish a new one. The second misunderstanding about Jesus was that he came to create new rituals and new dogma. He came to dissolve dogma and rituals. He was very opposed to any dogma, and his idea was to actually eliminate the dogma. And instead, the Orthodox Christianity later basically metamorphosized the entire teaching into dogma and rituals. And the third, what he never wanted to do was he never wanted to establish priesthood. In fact, his idea was to create a direct contact between the man and divine, to find the Christos within, to have that direct line between divine and the man, because the man is ultimately divine on its own. Instead, in the Orthodox Christianity, priesthood was established and basically became a dominant hierarchy that further solidified the dogma. But the Christian intent was quite opposite. So those were the ideas behind his teaching. And it's very easy to understand them because being an adept, he clearly knew that there is only one wisdom religion, that there is no many religions, and establishing something new to replace old is truly meaningless. Jesus also taught both exoteric teaching and he taught us esoteric teaching. What survived in the New Testament is just the exoteric teaching, the parables, the stories that he told to the people that they could understand at the time. He also left esoteric teachings that did not make it in the New Testament, and in fact were preserved by the Gnostic Schools. And one of the main sources of his esoteric teaching was the original Gospel of Matthew, and we'll talk later more about the Gospel of Matthew. I want to cover a few Gnostic groups that existed in the area to understand more the sources of inspiration for Jesus and where he drew the gnosis that was later transformed into the main Christian ideas. The first one that I mentioned was the Nazarenes, and Jesus spent lots of time in Nazareth, whether he was raised there or he came back and stayed there after his journey through Egypt. His family was also in Nazareth. There was a clear link to the Nazareth. And the Nazarenes was a Gnostic, pre-Christian Gnostic group that resided in Nazareth and was part of the Chaldean initiation, Chaldean tradition. So there were Chaldean initiates. And the main idea for the Nazarenes was that there is no personal God. There is just an absolute principle, and there is no personal God. So later on, when the Nazarene Gnostics became Christian Gnostics and they followed the Christian teachings, they also did not believe in the divine nature of Christ. They believed that he was a prophet and he was a man, and the only divine is the absolute principle. The other main belief of Nazarenes was that there is no creation, that the world was never created, there is no creation, everything is an emanation of that absolute principle. So you can see lots of parallels with Theosophy, because in fact this is the wisdom religion of Theosophy. There is no separation, it's one lineage. So they believed in the emanation of divine that permeates the universe, but nothing is being created. The subgroup of the Nazarenes was called the Ebionites. Ebionites are well known for the fact that most of the Jesus's family belonged to Ebionite group. So Jesus's family actually was not just the followers of the Mosaic law. They were part of the Ebionite group that was a subgroup of the Nazarenes. And what is interesting about the Ebionites was that John the Baptist, who was a relative of Jesus, was one of the main prophets of the Ebionites, and he was related to Jesus. So it was really a family, and lots of relatives who were part of the group. So the fact that Jesus was exposed to the Gnostic ideas was not a miracle. He grew up in the environment that was going far beyond just Mosaic law and Judaism. The Ebionites followed John the Baptist, and something that's very interesting that is found in the Ebionite sources is that John the Baptist was baptizing for 42 years before he baptized Jesus. And if you do the math, it appears that the Jesus, when he was baptized, should have been 60 years old. Otherwise, John the Baptist probably wouldn't be baptizing 42 years before. So that's one of the interesting facts. The Ebionites, again, think of them as the family of Jesus. once they adopted Christianity, they also did not follow Jesus as the God. Jesus was never personal God to them. He was a family member. He was a great prophet and a master, but they did not worship him. They also believed in the absolute principle and the divinity within, the Christos principle. What happens to both the Nazarenes and especially Ebionites, once the Orthodox Christians started getting the hand, the Ebionites were driven out of Nazareth. They had to leave and flee to Persia. So they settled in Persia and modern-day Iran and parts of Iraq. And in fact, it's one of the groups, actually a Nazarene group of Gnostics, is the only group that survived as an unbroken lineage until today. So today, basically in today's terms, they're transformed into Mandaeans, and Mandaeans still exist as a sect in Iran of Gnostic Christians, and they are followers of John the Baptist and the descendants of Ebionites. So this is one of the sort of fascinating facts about Jesus that often not covered well in the Christian sources. We've talked a little bit before about the Gospel of Matthew, that was the original source of the esoteric teaching of Christ. The original Gospel of Matthew is extremely important, and there was a lot of debate about it. And actually, if one were to look at the internet sources today, you may see refutations that the original Gospel of Matthew, also called Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, does not exist, that it's fantasy. The way it's being sort of conventionally called, that there was a Gospel of Matthew written in Greek, and there was a Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew written in Hebrew was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Chaldean and inscribed in Hebrew letters. So the meaning of words was Chaldean, and inscription was in Hebrew letters, and it had to have a key to be understood. It was highly esoteric. It consisted of sayings of Christ. Another word for the original Gospel of Matthew is Logia of Matthew. And the Logia of Matthew consisted of saying of Christ that were of highly esoteric nature, and they were given to the neophytes who were going through initiation. So they would have the key to understand the meaning. So without this key, in a way very similar to the secret doctrine, it will be just compilation of words, whether it's in Chaldean, Hebrew, or if it's translated in Greek. The way we know about the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, and it became an established historical fact, is from a number of sources. The first source is mostly 2nd century. In the 2nd century, it's the Bishop of Asia Minor, Papias, that mentions it, and it's being corroborated by Polycarp, who was a bishop of Smyrna, Bishop of Smyrna. So Polycarp also mentions the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. Later, this is also confirmed in the Irenaeus writing. Something fascinating that happens, this is the 2nd century. Then there is not much information coming from the 3rd. In the 4th century, Saint Jerome is being asked by one of the bishops to translate the original Gospel of Matthew, the Logia of Matthew. Once Saint Jerome starts reading it, and by understanding Saint Jerome had both knowledge of the Chaldean and Hebrew, he clearly understands that this is the esoteric version. The translation never makes it in the Greek version, so there remain 2 separate versions. But the translation was published was published in 4th century, but then forgotten and hidden and sort of became unknown again, because the understanding of this student is that once it was translated, it held very little meaning, because all of the sayings were not were cryptic. They were in symbols. They were really written for the neophytes or for the initiates. So that's the story of the Hebrew version of of the Gospel of Matthew. Both Nazarenes and Ebionites follow only original Gospel of Matthew. They don't recognize any of the other Gospels of the New Testament. This is the only Gospel that they follow. Some parts of the original Gospel of Matthew made it into the Luke's and Mark's Gospels. There's a debate of that, but there is some cross-reference that shows that maybe some parts of the Logia of Matthew made it into these two Gospels. But the Gospel of Matthew remains a main Gospel and main religious and spiritual text of the Gnostics. When we covered during the last talk Gnosticism and spoke of Basilides, he was, in the record, he was the student of Matthew. So he derived his information from the Matthew and supposedly from the Gospel of Matthew. So the Basilides may also, in his teachings, preserve some of the initial information. I tried to find Gospel of Matthew in any translation today. There is one reference to it in a book on Amazon. However, it was out of print and not available without any further notice. That was the only research that was mentioned, any scholarly research on the Hebrew version of Gospel of Matthew. So what else is happening in the first century? So we've talked about the different pre-Christian Gnostic sects, about the arrival of Christ and his time in Nazareth and him picking up the gnosis from all these different sects. The most important event that happens in the first century, and it is so important that we are still suffering the consequences of this, is the split between the Peter and Paul. This is the great split in the Christian tradition, and it's seldom being covered as such, but it really shaped the last 2,000 years, and we are still living the consequences of that split. When we look at the split between the two apostles were cardinally different. Peter was very conservative. He was a preserver of the Mosaic law and of the tradition. He wasn't open to any new ideas. And in fact, Peter was insisting that any Gentiles or pagans that are becoming Christian should adopt and become followers of the Mosaic law. Paul was, from many of the references of his language and his writing, was most likely, if not definitely, an initiate. He was an initiate in one of the esoteric schools, probably one of the theurgic mysteries, and he was a student of a wisdom religion. He was well aware of multiple schools, and he was practicing gnosis and embedding gnosis in his Gospels of Jesus' teachings. So two of them were radically different. The two groups, the two schools of Christianity formed at that time in the first century. The first school is a Christian Kabbalists of Jewish tradition, and the Christian Kabbalists of Platonic tradition. So they're both part of the Kabbalist tradition, one of Jewish, one of Platonic. The one of the Jewish tradition was mostly attracting the Jewish followers, and the one of the Platonic tradition was attracting lots of pagans and at that time called Gentiles who were joining that. There is no surprise that the Jewish Kabbalic Christian tradition was led by Peter, and the Platonic Christian tradition was led by Paul. So they're splitting not only on the basis of their understanding of Christianity, but they're also splitting along the ethnic groups. The Peter is leading the Jewish side, and Paul is leading the pagan side, and influenced by different traditions. There are many differences that arise between them. Paul is confronting Peter very openly about those differences. Peter is attacking Paul and basically calling him a coward in his beliefs, but in a more, so to say, passive-aggressive way in references to him, but they do not get along from the start. one of the major difference in the principles of, I don't want to call it belief, but in principles of the teaching was that Peter insisted in the personal nature of God. God was personal, and Christ was the God. God was personal in the image of Christ. Paul believed that God is an impersonal principle, it's divinity, it's an absolute, so he would not recognize the personal nature of the divine. And the second major issue was the Mosaic Law. Peter insisted that anyone who is joining Christianity from the pagan side should adopt Mosaic Law. Paul called this unnecessary. And you may be surprised, but the third major issue of division and unending battles was over circumcision. Peter insisted on circumcision. Paul said that this is not necessary. So those were the main three dividing points between the two. That were, two of them were drawing the followers that were also being part of the division. So when you think of the first century Christianity, it's not to be idealized in any way. It was very divisive, many divisive groups, with the two major divisions occurring along the Paul and Peter lines. It got so bad that they would not even socialize or talk to each other. So the Jewish Christian tradition and the Platonic Christian tradition, if the members of the both traditions would be in the same setting, they would not socialize, they would not offer hospitality, they basically were the arch enemies. And this is the early ages of Christianity, where Christianity is basically defending itself from the Roman world. So even within themselves, they were broken at that moment. That break will be increasingly significant down in history, because what happens at that time is the division along major lines that created the Church of Rome and the Gnostic Church. So that division results in the creation of Church of Rome and the Gnostics. Now 2,000 years ago, we know who won, but that victory was the greatest failure of the Western humanity, of the Western world that adopted Christianity. To summarize more the divisions that are very important. So the followers of Peter, the Orthodox Jewish tradition, believed in a personal God, in personalized Christ, and the most important aspect, they believed in faith, that by faith you're saved. You just need to have faith, blind belief. The followers of Paul, also called Gnostic heretics, believed in absolute principle, in a Christ principle, the Christos within, and in the gnosis, in knowledge. The things are not based on the faith alone, that there is a knowledge that comes from the wisdom religion, and we derive our conclusions and facts from the knowledge. I would like to do a reading on this topic. This is from Paul, of him defining sort of this principle belief. This I confess to thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers. Paul's heretical view of God included an equally heretical view of Christ. He never considered Christ as a man, but as a principle. If any man is in Christ, he said, he is a new creature. So if any man is in Christ, he is a new creature. So he is transformed. And again, I am crucified in Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. Here, Paul is speaking of our divinity. It's basically speaking in the Buddhist language of enlightenment. Once I'm enlightened, the Christ lives in me, and I'm a new creature, the free creature. I am the God. I am divine. This is very different from what we see today in the Bible. And what we see today in the Bible was the teaching of the Peter and the followers of Peter that became solidified in personalizing Christ as God. Now, I would like to cover a few Gnostic schools that followed the Paul's teaching. So we have the divide, we have the division. We talked about the Gnostic groups before Christ. Now there are Christian Gnostic groups that are following the gospel, the original gospel of Matthew and teachings of Paul. And there are 3 or 4 major schools. Again, only one, the one we discussed, the Nazarenes, that continued until today in an altered lineage. The other very important, 2 were Alexandrian and 1 was based in Ephesus. And the Alexandrian school, the first one that we should cover is the Therapeutai. Therapeutai also stands for healers. Therapeutai existed also before Christian tradition. There were the healer group that was based near Alexandria. And they're almost ascetic in their lifestyle. They consist mostly of women and men in their mature age who basically come to live together and contemplate on philosophy and religion. They are related to essence, but essence were much more worldly in their nature. They were much more open in living in the world, and Therapeutai were more ascetic and more secluded group that devoted their lives to the study of religion and philosophy. So Therapeutai were becoming one of the main Gnostic Christian groups that preserves the esoteric teaching of Christ, passed from the Matthew and Paul. They have they hold sacred the number 7. And for them, Sunday is very important. They do study 6 days a week, and on Sunday, on the 7th day, and this was before the Sunday was sort of canonized to be the day when nothing should be done. On the 7th day, they gather as a community and they commune together and share their knowledge. So this is interesting because it's almost like the predecessor of the Christian tradition of have church services on Sundays. So this was what Therapeutais did. And one of their main gospels, main writings, was the Gospel of Epistles. The other group to be mentioned that was very important in the days was the School of Ephesus. The School of Ephesus actually had a College of Ephesus, and that Gnostic group was concerned with the comparative study of religions. They studied Buddhism, they studied the Kabbalah, they studied Pythagorean school, the Platonic school, and it was studied in the College of Ephesus. They were very open and very rigorous about the gnosis derived from all of these traditions. And you can call them a universal secret, sect that brought together gnosis of all of the religions. So they were very educated, very scholarly group that devoted themselves to the study of religions and how they relate to Christianity. They were very, very fierce opponents of Orthodox Christians. They clashed severely with the followers of Peter and with the Orthodox Christians. And you can see why this is mostly on the third principle of disagreement, and that was faith versus knowledge. So Christians, the knowledge was not acceptable because faith was everything one needed to achieve salvation. The third group that was very, very interesting and very fascinating how the metamorphosis of the key symbol of this group took place in the Christianity, and this group is Ophites. Ophites was also called the Brotherhood of the Serpent, and the serpent was one of their key symbols. They almost worshipped the serpent, and the symbology of the serpent was that it was the supreme wisdom. Serpent represented not evil, not temptation, but supreme wisdom. It also represented the perfected man, and you can see the serpent symbol on the on our Theosophy symbology. It also represented the Christ principle in each man. So when you would look at the paintings of the Ophites and their art, there would be a cross with the serpent around the cross. So serpent was a very critical symbol of wisdom and transcendence of man. What is interesting, what happens to the serpent in the Christian tradition, it becomes the symbol of temptation, of evil, and of fall. And if you look deeper into the differences and disagreements between the Orthodox Christians and Gnostics, it was the knowledge. So if serpent represents the knowledge and wisdom, gnosis, of course, this is temptation for the fall. It's dangerous. So for the Orthodox Christians, they, in every possible way, try to stamp out the wisdom and the gnosis, and serpent becomes the tempter that basically seduces the Eve to eat the apple of knowledge, apple of gnosis, and that's beginning of the fall. So they perceived everything that the Gnostics taught as beginning of the fall, that whoever follows that will be the fallen man. So that's interesting. There are probably many more details and information how the symbol metamorphosized from wisdom and transcendence of man into the being the symbol of the devil and the fall. So, but it's a very interesting symbol. There is one more reading that can be of interest on the serpent and the way it should be understood in the teachings and the way it was misunderstood. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up. So again, it is a symbol of transcendence. Translating these words according to their symbolical meaning, the sentence would read, as Moses lifted up supreme wisdom in the wilderness of false beliefs, so must the Christos principle be lifted up to the place of supreme. Ruler of man is to fulfill his real destiny. Be ye therefore wise as serpents. Serpent is based off the symbol of Mahatmas. Be wise as Mahatmas and as harmless as doves. So this is the writing of the Ophites. And again, how the Christianity took that symbol and changed that. And now we're coming to the concluding summary of what happened in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. So there was a major conflict between Peter and Paul, resulting in the Church of Rome and in the Gnostic Church. They clashed according to 3 major beliefs, and these 3 beliefs espoused by the Gnostics are part of the wisdom religion and theosophy today, so very much relate to that. What happens to the Gnostic Church? They lose the battle in the history, but as esoteric knowledge, they were never to become the Church of Rome. That was not their role. The role of Gnosticism was to preserve the wisdom religion for us one day to come back to it. What happens in the 1st century is the initial conflict. In the 2nd century, and that's what we've studied during the last talk, in the 2nd century, this is the beginning of refutation. This is when the Orthodox Christians are fighting Gnostics through the method of refutations. They refute in their writings everything that Gnostics are saying. So we've studied about Irenaeus, we've studied about Justin the Martyr, about Tertullian, where they're refuting the Gnostic beliefs. From 2nd century refutations, in 3rd century, this escalates further to anathema of the Gnostics. So basically, they are not being considered part of the Christian religion. So they're being anathemized by the Orthodox Christians. The most significant event happens in the 4th century. This is where the Orthodox Christians actually take the symbology, take the symbols and the teachings of the Gnostics, and then metamorphosize this into the dogma and basically symbols that are meaningless. So the teaching of Gnostics become a dogma or upside down symbols. And the example that we've looked at before is the example of the serpent. The serpent was a Gnostic symbol, but then in 4th century, it becomes the symbol of the devil and the man's fall. So they're taking they borrow Gnostic ideas, and they turn them into the rituals and dogma of the modern Christianity. Now, what would you do once you plagiarize something? You destroy the source of your plagiarism, so it becomes yours. So this is exactly what happens in the 5th century. The Orthodox Christianity destroys all the sources from where they plagiarized the symbology of the Gnostics that was turned into the dogma and rituals, and they do a very methodical burning and destruction of all gospels of the Gnostics, like that never existed. So this is where much of the knowledge of the Gnosis is lost, but not all. Some of the information still comes from the cross references from 2nd century refutations, and some was discovered in Qumran, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in the future, we may have a talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and what they signified to the wisdom religion and our understanding of Gnostics today. But again, this is the 4 stages of struggle that take place: the refutations in the 2nd, and 3rd, the borrowing of the ideas in the 4th, and destruction of all sources in the 5th. And this results in the modern Christianity, and it doesn't matter which denominations, be it Protestant, Catholic, any other, they're all based on one branch of the conflict, and that's the teachings of Peter and his way to view things, and elimination of the Gnostic school. So for the 2,000 years, the beliefs and points of view of the Western civilization were defined by that conflict. This is why it's so interesting to look at that conflict and understand what was at the core of that, to understand where we are today. And not only it defined our viewpoint, it defined our scientific discovery, it delayed our knowledge in many spheres, because Christianity of belief was holding back all the gnosis, all the knowledge. And we are still living in the aftermath of the Dark Ages created by the conflict in the 1st century and events following in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. We're still in that aftermath, and that's why it's so important to revive the teachings of Gnostics and make them known and understand where we're coming from in the conflict that we're still in today. And to understand that unity is not something given, it is something that comes through knowledge, through understanding, through acceptance, and following the wisdom religion and Theosophy and the teachings of HPB they were given to us. And again, I want to make parallel between now HPB and Jesus, because HPB did not come to create a new religion. She came to purify the wisdom religion, the Theosophy that was there with us for ages. So every adept that comes to purify the wisdom religion that always existed, always will exist, and can never be eliminated. It's only our forgetting that has to be eliminated in us. And that comes with what Gnostics called the Christos within, the Christos principle, that once you have that in you, you are a new creature. That's something we read in one of the readings. I'll conclude the talk now, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer. It was a very dense topic. It took many hours for the student to learn all of this, but it was a very interesting discovery.
In the reading, it said we are two gods. It said that. In the religion that I was brought up in, there's only one. You cannot attain that level. So when we come up with this HPB's purification process, which is very much associated with Paul's.
Mhm.
There's a lot of resistance, and there still is to this day to the, I would say, the purified teachings, because we have now gotten to the point where we have to first unlearn a lot of stuff we learned before we can really grasp the teachings of Theosophy and the teachings of Paul.
Mhm. Mhm. It is almost as a hypnosis. If you always hear only one thing, and imagining that the other side exists is almost impossible. We did not know about the Gnostic side basically until the 50s when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It was more of a myth. It almost was like Atlantis. But one day we will find facts of Atlantis too, but not yet. But Gnostics were the same. It was just a story until the first evidence was found. But it is something that shocked me a bit in preparing for this talk, that basically the knowing of this history is a privilege of scholars, in-depth scholars of Christianity, or anything that exists in the mainstream media on the internet is undigestible. It is or literally some stories, or the information not there. That you really have to go to a very in-depth scholarly articles by the historians of the Christianity, or you will find basically nothing. I tried to find any sources of the original Logia of Matthew. It does exist. It was translated. There were so many refutations even today. There was one very interesting Quora question where one person asked, "Where can I find it?" And there were 2,000 people telling him there is nothing to search, it does not exist. But then there was another Catholic source. It was a Catholic history site that was basically cross-referencing Polycarp and mentioning the original Gospel of Matthew. It was acknowledging there was a Hebrew gospel. And it was talking that it would be natural for Matthew to write in Hebrew. Why would he write in Greek? That was his language. That there is, it's not something to question why he did that. That was his language. He wrote the first gospel in his language. Maybe later somebody wrote it in Greek or translated, but it would be quite natural for him to write it in Hebrew.
We have a question from Lenning.
Hi, yes. My question, which I wrote it here too, where do the Cathars fit into the topics discussed in today's talk?
Can you say again, Lenin, who?
The Cathars, Catharism. They are, it could be considered somewhat of a subdivision of Gnosticism, or pre-Christians, post-Christians. I don't know if
we'll cover today only the main Gnostic sects. There were many. So Cathars could have been one of the smaller ones that did not come through in the readings that I did, but there were multiple sects and groups and subgroups of the Gnostics. The whole nature of Gnostics was opposite to the Church of Rome. It had no hierarchy. It was very much as the United Lodges of Theosophists. So it was non-hierarchical. It could have been started anywhere. It had no bishops. So that would be one of the groups that just did not come up in the readings.
Okay, I have another question. Can I ask it?
Mm-hmm.
The Library of Alexandria was burned, and that event is considered to be somewhat of a big transition in between paganism and Christianity, kind of really taking over. Does Gnosticism fit into any of that?
there were not many Christian Gnostic scrolls at the Library of Alexandria, because at that time, Gnostics are not even mentioned by any historians of the time. It is so minor. It's like little small groups, and all the Christians, even the followers of Peter and Paul, it was non-significant teachings in the ancient world. The comparison I would like to have about the Alexandrian library that contained lots of Gnostic texts pre-Christian. So lots of theurgic mysteries, lots of pre-Christian Gnostic texts were there, and they were lost. So the first disasters that befell humanity was the burning of the library. That's where we lost the original Gnostic scrolls. And in the 5th century, through extermination of all of the teachings of Gnostics, we lost all the Christian Gnostic scrolls. So we lost both layers of the wisdom religion. So in that regard, they're related, because all of the original Gnostics pre-Christian, there was lots of scrolls of their teachings in the Alexandria library.
Interesting.
There was a discovery in 1945, and the specifics went out of my head, but it was a big jar of writings from the time of Jesus, the Gospel according to John, etc., was in there. Some peasants found this, and they were starting to use it so they didn't get all of it. But what they retained was pretty different than what the writings of the Bible. So,
And those are the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in Egypt. There were 3 major texts. The one is the original Gospel of Matthew, written in Hebrew, that was translated into Greek in the 5th century. So it exists in some excerpts. It does exist. It was translated. It existed. We can trace it to 5th century. The second one is Pistis Sophia in the, I believe, 1600s. And the last one was the one found by peasants, the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1950s, I believe. There may be some more, but those are the 3 major discoveries that give us some insight in the Gnostic teachings. And I would like to show the books on the topic. There is quite a library. And for those who would be in Washington, can borrow the books and read them. There is the Dead Sea Scrolls, basically what was mentioned about the scrolls found by the farmers. The Gnostic Religion. This is a very interesting publication by Secret Doctrine Reference Series, Gnostics and Their Remains. And that's, I believe, dating to 1800s. So this is pre-Qumran scrolls. And the well-known writer on Gnostics, Elaine Hagel's The Gnostic Gospel. The teaching itself is extremely complex. It's probably will take many years of study as of any mysteries to fully understand the cosmology and the philosophy behind them. They are really based on the original gnosis, and probably also requires the key. The students' attempts are just a very shallow attempts to understand it in depth.
there's good bit of writings of the Secret Doctrine and other places about this period that you just talked about, Gnosticism, and of course that is really Theosophy. Jesus was considered a great Theosophist, and there's a lot of write-up about him in that regard. And the Theosophy magazine has a lot of articles.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was an interesting mention of Chrèstos and Christos. Does anyone know the difference? Chrèstos, Christos. I wasn't aware of this. The one is written as Chrèstos with E, and then Christos with I. So the Chrèstos and the translation of Chrèstos is a good, pious man, a good man, a good, law-following, pious, kind, gentleman. And the Christos is the basically divine man. So this is a transition from the man who is just good to a man who embodies God. And it's not that the Christ was God. It was not about the Christ being God. It was the difference of the transition of internal enlightenment of becoming just a good man to being a man who is liberated through being God and not having the attachments and misconceptions, not just being good. So that was the transcendence, basically transcendent man. Like it's good to be good, but to be godlike, you have to be transcended, and that was the first reading. You have to have the Christ in. It's born in you. You are born in Christ. It has nothing to do with the physical Christ.
We all have that potential within us, Christos.
And this is the symbology of the Easter, of resurrection. It's not about the Jesus's resurrection. Jesus was the man. He died. He left us the teaching. He was a great adept and a master of Theosophy. But resurrection is a resurrection of Christos, of the divinity in us. It's us who are Chrèstos, just a good man, the first stage, who becomes resurrected in Christ. And if you understand the Gnostic translation of lots of scriptures, once again, the New Testament was borrowed from the Gnostics and just put into dogma, meaningless dogma. But if one understands the Gnostic teaching, you can go to church service and walk out having heard a whole different story. You will understand the symbology that was put in symbols and dogma. Because so many times at Easter you will hear, and the Christ has risen, and you have risen, and risen in you. And then there'll be talk of the dead man walking, and it's a dogma and symbols. But once you understand the Gnosticism, what it really means, it is the resurrection and transmutation of the divine in us, of the principle. So it's the knowledge that Jesus being an adept, bringing us from the wisdom religion.
I have a question. How do you think, why Roman Church won this battle? What is the main reason? I have my opinion. What's your opinion?
Because once again, the two divisions, the Roman Church was based on exoteric teachings of Christ. Gnostics were based on esoteric. You cannot go and establish an entire, Vatican based on esoteric teaching. It's esoteric. It's kept in secret and given only to initiates. It's not to be spoken to everyone. And exoteric was to bring people. The one interesting fact about the critical moment in the Roman Church and the followers of Peter was when Constantine decided to convert Romans into Christians. The way it was done, he promised every Roman citizen who converts to Christianity a robe, an amount of sum of money. Everybody wanted to get a sum of money and a new robe. So there were converts by the thousands, but the people were not really converting. They were just getting their sum of money tax break, getting the tax break and converting. And it's actually interesting that Constantine, that's an interesting fact that came across. We talked about the Therapeutites celebrating Sunday as a holy day because for them it was a holy day to commune together and share knowledge. 6 days you study, on the 7th day you share your knowledge. So it was about gnosis, about knowledge. And Constantine himself came from a pagan cult that worshipped the sun. And when he realized that there is some notion of that 7th day being holy, he said it will be a sun day. the day of the sun and will become the holy because it corresponds with my pagan cult of the sun. But it was nothing about studying for 6 days and in the seventh sharing the knowledge. So even that is lost because there's no knowledge in Christianity. There is just belief. You can't recite belief, and the premise of that is lost. Why
I
is
think that one of reasons, my opinion, that the Roman Church is very strong hierarchy organization, and it means, well, if you want to survive, you need to be organized and have hierarchy. That's my opinion.
Yeah, if you want to survive an established religion, but the goal of the Gnostics was preserving that.
That's why Roman Church is so strong till this time.
Any more questions online or in the room?
I have lots of questions, but I can't articulate them.
Just a comment. I recall reading a while ago that while the Catholic Church systematically destroyed the Gnostic documents and information, they preserved the refutations, and by doing that, they may also preserve some of the Gnostic literature almost on, so could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, most of what we know about the early Gnostic sects actually from refutations. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Pistis Sophia, it was mostly from refutations of Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Justin the Martyr. I wonder why they never thought that one day we will learn of the teaching from the refutations, but that was the main source of knowledge until basically until the century. That the Pistis Sophia was known in 1600s, but it became more of a source of Rosicrucians, of the Masons. So again, it was part of the more of a secret esoteric knowledge. The first one that became exoteric and was released to everyone was really the Dead Sea Scrolls. Until then, it's just the refutations. And that was, mentioned, was 2nd century. That's the way they started to combat the Gnostics through your refutations, and then it escalated.
Christianity was the example of the Gnostics and the other side. But does the major religions go through this cycle? I mean, they lose the meaning of what they started out to be. I was in a Masonic lodge, Philadelphia, the same thing. We asked him one of the Masons there, what is the foundation for Masonry? And he says, we've forgotten. He said, well, we do faith, hope, and charity, which is really a good thing in itself. But there's a basis for that, and we tend to lose that because it takes a lot of work to become a Gnostic. Put that in the inner being, and that's what we're trying to do. It's Theosophy.
Well, there are always the esoteric and exoteric sides of every religion. We do tend to forget, not to forget, but to prefer dogma to the knowledge. This student thinks that the most important is not the aspect of forgetting, but forbidding. It is a choice to forget or to remember, but once something is forbidden and exterminated, one cannot remember. That choice is eliminated. And that's why one of the biggest crimes of Christianity that I can name is really eliminating knowledge, because it eliminated the choice of someone to choose dogma or to choose the knowledge. So it eliminated free choice. One can stay with ritual, one can go deeper. It's a choice. We're all at different levels of the Jacob's ladder, and it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Of our spiritual evolution, but when that choice is taken away and the deeper esoteric knowledge no longer accessible, that's when it is it's so critical for humanity not to lose that. And The Theosophy is doing just that, of keeping that wisdom religion purified. And the other thought when I was reading about the first Christian groups and how divided they were, once you compare it to Theosophy, yes, we also had these divisions and the different groups, and it is natural. This is part of being Chrèstos.
Mhm.
Once we're Christos, we will be all united, we'll be one brotherhood. But actually, the dynamic of both groups was very similar. So that was quite interesting, and ideally it would come to one unification, not to victory of one and elimination of the other one, the way it happened in Christianity, where we lost the choice of seeing the other side.
Well, thank you for doing all this research. It really came out today in a few minutes. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I think we will close now, and we will have a next Sunday discussion online.
Next Sunday we will continue with our study of the ocean of the, which is Mr. Judge made this amendment, the secret doctrine. The secret doctrine is a lot more detailed, but the ocean of theosophy is easier to absorb in the kind of form that we're doing. So we're sort of walking through the secret doctrine, which would take years to get through if we try to do it that way.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you. See
Yeah,
you in
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.